The forests of the Ohio Valley echoed with war cries, smoke curled from burning villages, and the ground trembled under the charge of warriors united to defend their homelands. Muskets misfired, arrows whistled through the air, and chaos consumed the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers of the young United States, barely trained and far from home, clashed with a confederacy of native tribes determined to stop the relentless tide of settlers. In a few hours, hundreds of American soldiers lay dead, and the future of the frontier trembled on the edge of a knife. The United States of the 1790s was a fragile nation, new and untested. It had won independence, but the victory brought no peace to the West. Beyond the Appalachians stretched vast forests and fertile valleys, home to native nations who had thrived for centuries. To settlers and politicians, these lands represented opportunity, farmland, rivers, and a promise of expansion. To native peoples, they were sacred, vital, and defended fiercely. As settlers moved west, tensions erupted into skirmishes and raids. Every new cabin, every cleared field drew a line of conflict through the land. Leaders among the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and other tribes recognized that no single nation could resist the Americans alone. They formed a confederacy, a united front to defend their homes. In 1791, this confederacy confronted General Arthur St. Clair's army in Ohio. Over 1 out of 400 U.S. soldiers advanced into the forest, unaware that a force of more than 1,000 native warriors lay in ambush. By midday, St. Clair's troops had suffered their worst defeat in U.S. history, over 600 soldiers killed. The Ohio Valley remained under native control for now. The United States would not forget this humiliation. Washington raised a new, disciplined army under General Anthony Wayne, trained to fight in the forests and against guerrilla tactics. In 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne's Legion met the Confederacy in a devastated woodland after a violent storm had knocked down trees, creating natural cover. The native warriors struck with ferocity, but Wayne's disciplined soldiers held their lines, bayonets thrust forward. After hours of brutal combat, the Confederacy was forced to retreat. The resulting Treaty of Greenville, 1795, ceded vast tracts of Ohio and Indiana to the United States. The frontier moved west, but the seeds of further conflict were sown. From the smoke of defeat rose Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader with a vision of continental resistance. He argued that no single tribe could cede land. The land belonged to all native peoples. Alongside his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, Tecumseh built a movement at Prophetstown, drawing warriors and families from dozens of nations. He preached resistance, cultural revival, and unity. His charisma drew attention far beyond the Ohio Valley, and he began traveling across the Midwest and South, seeking alliances. Tecumseh's goal was audacious, a pan-tribal confederacy capable of confronting the United States. In 1811, Tecumseh left Prophetstown to recruit allies. In his absence, U.S. forces under William Henry Harrison attacked. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, warriors fought fiercely but were ultimately driven back, and Prophetstown was burned. Tecumseh returned to unite his people with British forces during the War of 1812. His warriors helped capture Detroit and won early victories, terrifying settlers across the frontier. But at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, Tecumseh was killed. His death fractured the Confederacy, ending the dream of a united native resistance. By the 1810s, the United States had secured the Ohio Valley and much of the Midwest. Settlers poured in, establishing towns, farms, and new states. Native nations were increasingly confined. Treaties were signed under duress, and the frontier line continued to move west. The cycle of resistance and defeat was clear. Native nations resisted, were overwhelmed militarily, signed treaties under pressure, and were gradually displaced. The stage was set for a century of expansion under the banner of Manifest Destiny, a push that would engulf the continent and bring countless conflicts in its wake. Smoke rose from abandoned villages, and the forests of the Ohio Valley fell silent once more. The victories of the Confederacy had slowed the American advance, but could not stop it. Tecumseh's dream had died on the battlefield, yet the hunger for land and the drive westward pressed on. The frontier was moving, and with it, the forces of expansion and resistance collided, a collision that would define the next century. Snow fell relentlessly across the Appalachian trails in the winter of 1838. Families stumbled through knee-deep drifts, their breath clouding the frigid air. Children clung to their parents, shivering and crying. Elders collapsed along the icy path, too weak to rise. Soldiers with bayonets drove them forward, herding them west like cattle. Fires that once warmed homes and villages had long been extinguished, and the wilderness stretched endlessly ahead. This was not a migration. It was a forced march, a death sentence, later etched into memory as the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, a man forged by the frontier, rose to the presidency with a reputation as a warrior and an uncompromising leader. He had fought in the Revolutionary War as a boy, survived attacks and captivity, and later defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. But Jackson's greatest campaigns were not abroad. They were against native nations resisting American expansion. In the Southeast, Jackson waged war on the Creek Nation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, crushing their resistance and opening millions of acres to settlement. For Jackson, native nations were obstacles to be removed, not sovereign communities to coexist with. By 1829, he brought this same philosophy into the Oval Office, determined to clear the eastern lands for white settlement at any cost. In 1830, Jackson pushed through Congress the Indian Removal Act, a law that would forever change the lives of tens of thousands of Native Americans. The legislation claimed to offer Native nations a voluntary exchange, surrender lands in the east and move west of the Mississippi to territories supposedly secure and permanent. In return, the government promised money, supplies, and new lands. In practice, the promises were hollow. Removal was rarely voluntary. Military force, coercion, and the destruction of villages ensured compliance. Resistance was met with violence, starvation, or arrest. Settlers and state governments demanded the land, and the federal government supplied the force. Figures like Davy Crockett opposed the act in Congress, warning it was unjust and immoral. But Jackson's influence was decisive. The law passed, and removal became official U.S. policy. The Indian Removal Act targeted 5 major nations in the Southeast: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Muscogee, Seminole. Known as the 5 civilized tribes, these nations had long adopted aspects of European American life. They farmed, ran schools, printed newspapers, and created governments modeled on American constitutions. The Cherokee, in particular, had developed a written language, a functioning judicial system, and a capital at New Echota, resembling a frontier town more than a traditional village. Despite their adaptation and assimilation, the tribes were under constant pressure. Settlers coveted their lands, rich in resources, gold, and fertile soil. Political and military pressure forced the tribes into a position where their survival was dependent on compliance. The Cherokee turned to the courts to resist removal. In Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, declaring the Cherokee Nation a sovereign political entity and stating that Georgia had no authority to impose laws on their territory. On paper, it was a monumental victory. In practice, the ruling was ignored. Jackson reportedly refused to enforce it, leaving the Cherokee exposed to state aggression. The legal triumph became a symbolic victory at best, while the reality of forced removal loomed closer with every passing year. By the late 1830s, the Cherokee were rounded up by U.S. soldiers. Families were given hours to collect belongings, often losing everything. Homes were burned or confiscated. Sacred sites and ancestral lands were abandoned forever. The march westward was brutal. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, poorly supplied camps. Harsh winter storms struck travelers with little shelter. Hunger and exposure claimed thousands of lives. Soldiers enforced the march with threats and violence. By the time survivors reached the territory now known as Oklahoma, more than 4,000 Cherokee had perished, nearly 1/4 of the nation. The Choctaw had preceded them, enduring starvation and exposure during their removal in 1831. The Creek and Chickasaw followed, suffering chains, disease, and broken promises. Each trail was a trail of tears, lives uprooted, families shattered, and entire cultures displaced. Not all tribes submitted quietly. In Florida, the Seminoles waged a relentless guerrilla war. Using the swamps and marshlands to their advantage, they ambushed U.S. troops and vanished into the wilderness, striking with precision and retreating before a response could be mounted. Led by the warrior Osceola, the Seminoles fought from 1835 to 1842 in what became the Second Seminole War, one of the longest and costliest Indian wars in U.S. history. Disease claimed more lives than battle, and thousands of soldiers were tied down in the swampy terrain. Osceola was eventually captured under a flag of truce, a betrayal that enraged many. He died in captivity, but his people's fight endured. Many Seminoles evaded removal entirely, retreating deeper into Florida's wilderness, a testament to resilience in the face of relentless pressure. The Indian removal era was not merely a policy, it was a campaign of displacement and cultural destruction. Over 100,000 Native people were forced from ancestral lands. Tens of thousands died from disease, exposure, and exhaustion. Sacred grounds and traditional homes were abandoned, never to be reclaimed. To American settlers, the eastward removal of native nations represented progress, land for farms, towns, and the expansion of the young nation. To Native peoples, it was devastation, an enduring wound on their communities and collective memory. This era did not end with the Trail of Tears or the Seminole Wars. It set the stage for further westward expansion, the rise of the doctrine of manifest destiny, and conflicts that would spread across the continent for decades. The forced march west had begun, leaving a legacy of pain, resistance, and unbroken determination. The prairie stretched endlessly under a blazing sun. Wagons creaked over rough terrain, their wooden wheels groaning with each rut. Families clung to the sides, dust choking their lungs, as oxen strained to pull their loads across rivers and rocky ground. Children screamed with exhaustion, and mothers whispered prayers to keep them moving. Behind them lay the world they knew. Ahead, an uncharted continent, a promise of land, wealth, and freedom, but also death. The march westward was unstoppable, driven by a belief that America was destined to span from ocean to ocean. By the 1840s, the phrase manifest destiny had begun to define the nation. Coined by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, it captured the belief that the United States was chosen to expand across the continent. Expansion was framed as both a duty and a divine right to spread democracy, Christianity, and civilization, whether the land was empty or already inhabited. This belief justified conquest, displacement, and war. It transformed westward migration from a series of isolated settlements into a national project. The frontier was no longer merely a place. It had become a vision of destiny, one that ignored the sovereignty of native nations, Mexico, and other peoples living on the continent. Thousands of settlers took the perilous Oregon Trail, following the promise of fertile land and opportunity. The journey was brutal. Rivers raged with spring melt, wagons sank into mud, and disease swept through camps. Cholera, dysentery, and smallpox claimed thousands, yet families pressed on, motivated by the dream of homesteads, farms, and a new life. Wagon trains became microcosms of the nation, carrying its hopes, fears, and ambitions across unbroken wilderness. Every mile traveled west symbolized the advance of American power and the shrinking of the world for native nations. Further south, the vast lands of Texas became a flashpoint. Settlers, many from the United States, ignored Mexican laws, bringing enslaved labor and demanding autonomy. Tensions escalated, and in 1836, the Texas Revolution erupted. The Battle of the Alamo became a rallying cry, a brutal siege where Texian defenders fell, their deaths immortalized in legend. By 1836, Texas had declared independence, but the U.S. was hesitant to annex it immediately, fearing war with Mexico. The push westward, fueled by manifest destiny, made conflict inevitable. The United States' annexation of Texas sparked the Mexican-American War, a brutal conflict that reshaped the continent. American troops advanced into northern Mexico, engaging in fierce battles at places like Monterrey, Veracruz, and Mexico City. The war was marked by strategic brilliance, logistical challenges, and extreme hardship. Soldiers endured heat, disease, and rugged terrain. Mexican defenders fought fiercely to protect their homeland, but the U.S. Army, fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny, pressed forward relentlessly. By 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded vast territories to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The nation had achieved its goal, coast-to-coast expansion, but at enormous human and cultural cost. As settlers poured into these new territories, native nations faced renewed displacement. The Western Plains became a battleground between tribes defending their homelands and settlers claiming land. The Plains tribes, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche, resisted fiercely. They adapted to new technologies, mounted raids, and engaged in strategic warfare to protect their lands and resources. Horses, firearms, and alliances allowed them to temporarily hold ground, but U.S. expansion and the lure of gold and farmland were relentless. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848 sent waves of settlers westward at unprecedented speed. The California gold rush was both a boon and a disaster. Wagon trains surged into the Sierra Nevada, rivers were dredged and poisoned, and native populations were decimated by disease, starvation, and violence. Indigenous communities, already weakened by disease and displacement, faced massacres and forced labor. California's statehood in 1850 formalized the loss of their lands, and state-sanctioned militias often carried out violent campaigns against them. Settlers' lives were harsh. Homes were built from scratch. Crops were vulnerable to drought and pests, and winters could be deadly. Conflicts with native nations were constant, ranging from raids to pitched battles. Families adapted with ingenuity. Hunting, bartering, and community networks sustained survival. Yet every mile westward meant lives lost, cultures displaced, and landscapes permanently altered. The frontier was both a dream and a crucible, a place where ambition collided with survival. Manifest destiny promised growth and progress, but its toll was immense. Native nations lost ancestral lands, sacred sites, and populations decimated by disease and warfare. Families were displaced repeatedly. Wars, forced treaties, and massacres marked nearly every mile of the westward push. For settlers, the journey was dangerous, unpredictable, and often deadly. Thousands died from exposure, disease, or violence. Yet the promise of land and opportunity drove the nation forward, embedding expansion as a moral and political imperative. By the end of the 1840s, the United States had grown from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Trails were carved across mountains and plains. Cities and farms began to dot the landscape. But the cost was written in blood, tears, and shattered nations. The doctrine of manifest destiny had succeeded in its goal. The nation stretched coast to coast. Yet this success came at the expense of countless lives, cultures, and ecosystems. Across the continent, the forces of expansion and resistance were converging, setting the stage for the bloody conflicts and wars of the coming decades. The sun rose over endless grasslands, painting the plains gold. A lone horse thundered across the horizon, dust trailing behind its hooves. Villages of teepees stirred awake, children rubbing sleep from their eyes, warriors scanning the distant tree line. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the morning haze, but the calm was fragile. Beyond the horizon, settlers advanced with wagons, railroads, and rifles. The land they had called home for generations was under siege. The plains were now a battlefield, the stage for a war that would define the fate of native nations. By the 1850s, the push west was relentless. Railroads crept across the plains, telegraphs stretched across the horizon, and towns sprouted like wildflowers after a rain. Settlers brought crops, livestock, and guns. Native nations faced a stark choice: resist or be displaced. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Arapaho, and others watched as buffalo herds, the lifeblood of their culture, dwindled under the pressure of hunting and settlement. The arrival of American soldiers and settlers was not merely a threat to territory. It was a threat to survival, to culture, and to identity itself. The U.S. government attempted to impose order through treaties, often under duress. Tribes were pushed onto reservations, small patches of land compared to their vast traditional territories. Treaties promised annuities, supplies, and protection, but in practice, these promises were frequently broken. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1851, tried to delineate territories for the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others. In exchange, tribes agreed not to attack settlers and allowed safe passage for travelers. But the lure of gold, fertile land, and railroad routes meant the government often ignored its own agreements. Conflict erupted almost immediately. Native warriors conducted raids on settlers and military outposts, defending their hunting grounds and communities. The Comanche became legendary for their mounted attacks, striking with speed and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. These raids were not acts of cruelty, but survival. With buffalo herds shrinking and lands being seized, native nations fought for food, water, and the freedom to continue their way of life. The U.S. Army responded with campaigns to pacify the plains. Soldiers established forts, pursued raiding parties, and conducted scorched earth tactics. The Indian Wars of the Plains were marked by brutal skirmishes, surprise attacks, and relentless pursuit. Battles such as Sand Creek, 1864, and Washita River, 1868, left entire villages destroyed. Men, women, and children were killed, and survivors were forced onto reservations. Soldiers viewed these campaigns as necessary to secure Western expansion, but they often resulted in atrocities that haunted the nation for decades. One of the most devastating strategies against the Plains tribes was the near extermination of the buffalo. Millions of buffalo once roamed the Great Plains, sustaining native economies, diets, and culture. Hunters, driven by commercial profit and military strategy, slaughtered the herds relentlessly. By the 1870s, buffalo numbers had plummeted from tens of millions to mere thousands. With their primary food source gone, Plains nations faced starvation, weakened resistance, and forced relocation to reservations. Resistance on the Plains was led by remarkable figures who became legends of courage and strategy. Red Cloud, a Sioux chief, orchestrated a successful campaign against U.S. forts along the Bozeman Trail in the late 1860s, culminating in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868. Crazy Horse, another Sioux leader, famously defeated Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, one of the most significant native victories in American history. Sitting Bull, spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Sioux, guided his people through battles and survival during the U.S. military campaigns. These leaders embodied resistance, courage, and tactical brilliance, standing as symbols of resilience in the face of overwhelming force. In 1876, tensions over the Black Hills of Dakota escalated into the Great Sioux War. Custer's 7th Cavalry attacked a combined force of Sioux and Cheyenne near the Little Bighorn River. Custer underestimated the number of warriors and overestimated his army's capabilities. Within hours, his forces were annihilated. The battle was a stunning native victory, a rare triumph against U.S. military power. Yet it came at a cost. The U.S. responded with overwhelming reinforcements, ultimately forcing the Sioux onto reservations. The Plains Wars reshaped the continent. Entire nations were uprooted, cultures disrupted, and populations decimated. Tens of thousands of native people were killed by violence, disease, or starvation. Traditional ways of life, once dependent on the open plains and buffalo, were destroyed. Settlers gained land, railroads, and resources. Towns and cities emerged along the rail lines. Agriculture expanded, and the U.S. achieved its westward ambitions. But these gains came with a moral cost: the forced displacement and near destruction of native civilizations. Survivors of the Plains Wars were often confined to reservations, land drastically smaller than their traditional territories. Food was rationed, dependence on government supplies increased, and cultural practices were restricted. Children were sent to boarding schools aimed at assimilation, while adults struggled to maintain traditions under oppressive oversight. The open plains, once the heart of their identity, were gone. Yet even in these harsh conditions, native nations adapted, resisted, and preserved their cultures for future generations. The sun set across the empty plains, casting long shadows over abandoned hunting grounds and scattered buffalo bones. Smoke from small reservation villages curled into the sky, a quiet testament to survival amidst devastation. The frontier had been conquered, but not without leaving deep scars. The Plains Wars were not merely battles over land. They were a war for life, culture, and sovereignty. The forces of expansion had won, but the spirit of resistance endured, echoing across the plains and into the generations that followed. The plains were quiet now, but the silence was deceptive. Smoke rose from distant camps. The wind carried whispers of fear and defiance. The roar of gunfire had faded, replaced by the relentless grind of railroads, towns, and encroaching settlers. Tribes once free across vast territories now clung to the edges of their ancestral lands, hunted, starved, and forced into submission. Yet the final battles of the frontier were far from over. The struggle for survival, sovereignty, and dignity would not end quietly. By the late 1870s, the U.S. government had secured most of the western territories. Railroads connected the coasts, and settlers moved in droves, farming, mining, and establishing towns. Native nations faced starvation, disease, and mounting military pressure. The government's policy was clear: confine, control, and assimilate. Reservations became prisons in all but name. Any attempt to leave or resist was met with force. For tribes like the Nez Perce, Apache, and Ute, survival meant constant movement and negotiation, often under impossible circumstances. In 1877, the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, became symbols of both resilience and tragedy. U.S. officials demanded they relocate from their lands in Idaho to a smaller reservation in Washington. Rather than submit immediately, Chief Joseph led his people on a daring retreat of over 1,400 miles toward Canada. Along the way, his warriors engaged U.S. troops in skirmishes, using clever tactics to evade capture. Families marched tirelessly through rivers, mountains, and snow, carrying the elderly, sick, and children. Eventually, just 40 miles from the Canadian border, exhaustion and overwhelming military pressure forced Joseph to surrender. His speech at the moment of surrender captured the heartbreak of the era. "I will fight no more forever." The Nez Perce were sent to Oklahoma, thousands of miles from their homeland, marking a devastating chapter of forced removal. Further south, the Apache Wars raged in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. The Chiricahua Apache, led by Geronimo, resisted U.S. and Mexican forces for decades. They were unmatched in knowledge of the terrain, using guerrilla tactics to evade capture. Geronimo's raids were legendary, fast, brutal, and precise. Soldiers pursuing him endured heat, lack of water, and ambushes in the rugged mountains. Yet by 1886, relentless military campaigns, dwindling supplies, and pressure from both U.S. and Mexican forces forced Geronimo's surrender. The surrender marked the end of armed native resistance in the continental United States, though the spirit of resistance lived on in communities and traditions. Even after major military campaigns ended, tensions persisted. In 1890, the Ghost Dance movement swept across reservations, a spiritual movement promising the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of settlers. U.S. authorities, fearful of rebellion, acted preemptively. On December 29, 1890, soldiers surrounded a Lakota camp at Wounded Knee Creek. A scuffle escalated, guns fired, and chaos erupted. More than 250 Lakota men, women, and children were killed, many shot at point-blank range. Wounded Knee became a symbol of the brutal closing of the frontier, marking the final large-scale massacre of Native peoples by U.S. forces. It was the end of an era of open conflict, but also the beginning of a century of struggle for recognition, rights, and survival. After the wars, the U.S. government focused on assimilation. Boarding schools attempted to erase native languages, customs, and religions. Children were taken from families, punished for speaking their mother tongues, and taught European American values. Tribal lands had been reduced to small reservations, often in arid or infertile regions. Dependence on government rations became necessary, yet communities survived. Families maintained traditions in secret, preserved oral histories, and adapted new skills to endure the pressures of imposed life on reservations. The closing of the frontier destroyed centuries-old ways of life. Nations that had thrived across vast territories were confined to tiny plots of land. Sacred sites were lost, hunting grounds depleted, and populations decimated by disease, starvation, and violence. For Native Americans, the losses were more than physical. Language, culture, governance, and spiritual practices were threatened, creating trauma that would echo through generations. Settlers gained land, wealth, and opportunity. Railroads, mines, and towns expanded across the continent. The United States had achieved its manifest destiny, stretching from coast to coast. But the expansion came at a profound human and moral cost. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. There were no longer vast, unsettled lands to conquer. The continent, once full of open plains, forests, and free native nations, had been transformed into farms, towns, railroads, and reservations. The wars that had defined the expansion of the United States, from the Ohio Valley to the Great Plains, from Texas to the Southwest, had ended. Yet the struggle for native sovereignty, identity, and survival continued in new forms within reservations, schools, and courts. The sun set over the transformed plains, railroads cut the landscape, settlers' towns dotted the horizon, and buffalo, once roaming in millions, were now shadows in memory. Ghosts of battle lingered in abandoned villages and on the trails of the forced migrations. The frontier had closed. The wars were over. The land was conquered. But the stories of courage, resistance, and survival endured, echoing across generations, a testament to those who had fought to defend their homes, cultures, and ways of life in the face of overwhelming force. The age of open warfare may have ended, but the legacy of the Indian Wars, the displacement, death, and resilience remained etched into the very soil of the nation.